Hey, everybody, welcome back to the show. One of my absolute favorite things about getting to host this show, this is one of the days where we kind of get to disregard the name of the show, where we get to have conversations outside of our normal purviews and talk a little bit deeper about strategies in different industries and find different ways to better serve our communities across our entire user base. And today, that conversation is going to center a little bit more around public safety. I know that you've probably seen many manufacturers, service providers asking questions about that world, not only of safety and security, but going that next step deeper and talking public safety. So I wanted to bring on someone today who gets to live in that world every day, not only live in it, but work in the business development and marketing side of the house. And that's Nitin Kartik, Director of Product Marketing and Public Safety, and one of the top product marketing voices on LinkedIn. Nitin, it's so great to see you. Thanks for coming on.
Ben, it's a real pleasure, and I'm excited about our conversation today.
Well, I'll tell you what, I think that this might be the first time that many folks in our audience have had the chance to meet you or hear about you. So I want to ask, just set the table for us. Talk to us a little bit about your background. I know obviously that started outside of public safety, but also your journey into the world of public safety. How did that start for you?
Yeah, so a couple of interesting things about me, Ben. I've had the fortune of actually living on three different continents. I was born in India. I grew up in Africa. Now I live in the US. In terms of my education, I have my master's from Stanford. I got my MBA at the University of Chicago. Another quick fun fact, as we're talking about my background, I've also been featured on BBC TV. Do check out my LinkedIn profile, and you'll be able to see a quick video. And in terms of my professional experience, I have over 10 years of experience at the director level with tech titans like Amazon, as well as smaller companies in the public safety as well as other spaces. I have cross-industry experience, not just public safety, but also healthcare, e-commerce, automotive, media. And so really, I find that to be a blessing. I've also been able to look at how product marketing works in B2G in the government space, B2B in the enterprise space, and in B2C in the consumer space. So I'm really excited to share some of the learnings that I have and help the audience with new nuggets of wisdom.
Well, I'll tell you what, we appreciate you coming on. And I think a good place to really start when we're talking about public safety is sort of defining who the stakeholder or buyer community is. I think it's easy for people to, when they hear public safety, they might think EMS or police or fire. In reality, that world is a lot of different things, right? You can loop government in there as well. If you could for us, just make some distinctions. Who are kind of those core buyers and stakeholders primarily in that world of public safety?
Yeah, so public safety, of course, is a very, very large space. So some of the spaces that I've had the good fortune of working at companies like Rapid SOS and now Carbine, largely it is selling to centers who take 911 calls. So when you make an emergency call or 911, you have a situation happening, an emergency. There are thousands of centers around the country that can take your call. And these centers need software, they need technology. And so companies like Rapid SOS and Carbine, we provide technology into these agencies. Sometimes it can be a police department, it can be a sheriff's office, sometimes it's a fire department. So think of wherever they handle 911 calls. That's the area of public safety that I've had the fortune of working at Rapid SOS and Carbine.
Well, and do you see too, one of the questions that I think people have is, obviously when you think public safety, obviously that you think public sector, but there's sort of a business element and a B2B element to it as well. Do you see a lot of demand for similar technologies, especially in kind of the private sector as well?
Yeah, when we look at selling to government agencies and selling to businesses and even consumers, I'll tell you, there are a few similarities between all of these. And then, of course, there are some differences. What things are similar? It's about relationships, right? Think of it as a marathon, not a sprint. You're not going to, pitch and then boom, you're going to make the sale. It doesn't happen that way. We all have to leverage data-driven insights where we have to adapt, we have to pivot, we have to optimize. So that's the same. Trust and credibility, it's huge. It's important whether you're selling a consumer product. It's even more important when you're selling to a business, and it is super important when you're selling to a government agency. If we think about, Ben, some of the differences, we can look at it as the target audience, for example, with government agencies. Of course, we're talking about police departments, fire departments, people like that. With businesses, it may be a major enterprise, or it could be a small business. Consumers, of course, is people like you and me. If we think about the decision-making process, it tends to be longest in the government space, with good reason. It's taxpayer money. You got to be careful about spending every dollar of that. With large enterprises, it is a little bit smaller, but still it can be very bureaucratic. With consumer, of course, it's very emotional and can be very short cycle. The relationship building in consumer space, it largely is branding and advertising. In the government space, it's heavily thought leadership because they want to make sure that they're buying for the long term. With the channels, there's you still got to do your social media. You still have to leverage influencers in your space. With enterprises, it is more like trade shows. With the government sales, it's very heavily trade shows, and you got to have one-on-one meetings because again, you're selling something, and in our case, it could be a life and death technology. Messaging. So there are many ways that these things differ. And what I can tell you is, as long as you play the long game, understand what your customer wants, and give them exactly that, that's really the recipe to success.
Well, it's interesting. One of the things you brought up is the idea of trust, and not only consumers, but a business and organizational trust too. It's challenging at times because as service providers and manufacturers, we like to a lot of times live in the world of, let me tell you how great my product is. Let me tell you how great these things are. But the element of brand equity and trust and thought leadership and teaching and training and certification is so uniquely important in that world of public safety. How do you find that balance between obviously that thought leadership and kind of market development standpoint, but also maybe trying some of those conversations in the world that are a little bit more consumer centric? How do you find that balance?
Yeah, it is hard. It's not easy. And you mentioned thought leadership, right? In the government space, it is super important. It's also important when you talk about large enterprise businesses, which tend to be very bureaucratic and almost work like governments. So one way I can explain this is I can give you an example from my experience. So a few years ago, I was working with an organization where we had a very bureaucratic sales process, and it was frustrating. And we understand, look, many of these buyers, they cannot buy on emotion. They got to go through their process, and that can be frustrating if you're the seller. So what we realize is the importance of thought leadership for this customer group. And so we said, okay, how are we going to do that? The product that we were selling at the time, it involved the use of real-time traffic data. So on the roads, there's traffic congestion. So our solutions, we were measuring all of that and providing that kind of as a service. So we said, hey, we would use our data and come up with a report called the traffic report that would list traffic congestion in cities, not just in the US, but all around the world. And we would even rank them. And we labeled Mexico City, for example, as the traffic capital of the world in that year when we were doing the analysis. And this was a very interesting way of showcasing our thought leadership because we had the data, we could do this analysis, and we were kind of an authority, and we could talk about that. This got a lot of buzz then. A lot of news agencies wanted to talk to us. In fact, the BBC interview that I mentioned, this was actually about that. And so our own people were watching, our customers were watching, okay? And this and a bunch of other hard work that our teams did cemented our position as a thought leader in the space. And this actually helped us win over $40 million in long-term contracts from our customers. So the point I'm trying to make is when you're selling to a very bureaucratic organization that has a lot of processes that they have to follow for good reason, don't ignore the power of thought leadership.
Well, that's an incredible point too, and the public safety industry isn't really unique to this, but you look at it really B2B as a whole. Decision makers are evolving rapidly. Channels are evolving rapidly. There's demand for direct to consumer. I mean, there's all sorts of different things happening, and you're finding different buyers and different stakeholders coming into the industry who may not have the expertise. Public safety is a great example, right? You've got IT managers now that are used to device management and setting up VPNs now who have to be accountable for cybersecurity attacks and things like that, right? Things that were sort of out of their purview. We as an industry have to educate those people at a much higher level than we do, maybe even 2 to 3 years ago, maybe 5, 6 years ago. It depends. Post COVID, everything sort of changed a little bit. But how do you kind of hyper target those folks that are sort of new to the industry for the first time, that may not have that, they may not have any brand affinity whatsoever? How do you start with those people at the top?
Yeah, and you mentioned top, right? That is really the way to look at it. So, like a lot of marketing, you look at it as a funnel, and the top of the funnel is the people who maybe at the awareness stage, they're becoming aware of what kind of products and services you offer. And then, of course, as you get to the mid funnel, you get to consideration, and then the actual decision comes at the bottom of the funnel. So, people at the top of the funnel, they don't maybe know that you exist. So, you first have to understand they may have never heard of you, in which case you want to put out, whether it is thought leadership, or maybe you can focus on advertising. You can even focus on owned media. So for example, your organic social media, put some information out there so people at least are familiar with who you are, maybe a little bit about what kind of products you offer. Choose a familiar category. Chances are, if you're selling something, it's likely not like a chat GPT that took all of us by storm and created a whole new category by itself. Chances are there's an existing category. So position yourself, hey, we are the best provider for this. So it's a known category. Oh, okay. So your company does these kinds of solutions. Then you want to focus on the competitive landscape and find what makes you unique and gives you some advantages over your competitors. So people are not like, oh, this is yet another vendor. Everybody's going to say the same thing.
Right.
So be honest with yourself and find what is unique about you. And then you may find that there are 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 things that are unique about you compared to the competition. Focus on that. Come up with your own point of view. Hey, we believe in a world, let's say you're a low cost provider, right? We believe people should not pay any more than necessary for their products and services. And let's show you how. If, let's say, you're like a premium Mercedes-Benz kind of a provider, we believe that there should be no compromise when it comes to quality of the products and services. And let's show you how. So these are some ways, you draw people from the awareness towards consideration and ultimately towards buying.
Well, look, it's the buying cycle. Obviously, I mentioned is evolving, but let's say, hey, we win that deal, right? We've done a great job at reaching and teaching folks. The public safety in the public sector world, I think as a whole, doesn't like change. So retention is a really good opportunity from a manufacturer and service provider standpoint. So that really changes kind of uniquely how we do things like account-based marketing or customer retention marketing, things like that. How have you found success from a marketing standpoint in retaining some of those clients instead of maybe having to reach them at a higher customer acquisition cost on the front end, but keeping and retaining that business on the back end?
Yeah, and you very rightly pointed out that in some industries, like public safety, people are a little bit hesitant to change. And, that can be a good thing. It can also be a bad thing. It's a good thing because maybe once you're in, it may be harder to replace you. It could be a bad thing because people may think 100 times before getting someone like you in there. But even in these industries, you do find sometimes that there is a retention problem. You're able to onboard customers and you have a leaky bucket. People are leaving out the bottom. So I'll give you an example. Once we had a situation where we were trying to find who is the right ideal customer profile for our product. And because we had this problem, right? People were coming in and there was a leaky bucket, people were leaving. We mainly had like a free trial offer. So we said, hey, you know what? You get started for free. And then once you fall in love with the product, you will help onboard you as a paying customer. Guess what? A lot of people didn't fall in love with our product. So we went back to the drawing board. We said, we got to look at the ideal customer profile. And we realized there were two things, Ben, that were needed. And this was a subscription service. One, you want people who really love your product. Two, you want people who have a budget to pay for your product.
Yes.
Okay, that's how a subscription business works. So what we were doing until that point was we were finding people who love the product, but we weren't focusing or qualifying enough on the budget and the willingness to pay. And so, there's no surprise, like people were coming in and leaving out the back door. So we said, okay, we got to change that up. So instead of having a free trial offer, we offered our customers a deeply discounted pilot, like a deeply discounted trial. And this it had very interesting effects because the people who had no intention of paying, they never signed up. And we were okay with that. We were like, hey, thank you. Maybe, we're not the right fit for you. Like if you have no budget, you don't want to pay, you just want the free service, maybe we're not the right partner for you. Maybe there are other people out there. And so it lowered the number of people who actually took the offer, but it improved the retention dramatically. In fact, 31% improvement in retention compared to the other programs that we had going. And so this is another important lesson. When you're worried about retention, it may be okay to trade off a little bit lower acquisition as long as you get higher quality customers so that you aren't having this leaky bucket problem. So that was one of the big lessons that I learned, Ben.
Well, I think you kind of hit on a subject that's a soft spot for a lot of marketers, and something really that we've realized recently is it's quality over quality over quantity. Where especially when you've nailed down your ICP, say you're targeting let's just say there's 100 underwater welders in the world, right? It's great to get a million eyeballs on a piece of content, and it's cool to be able to walk into your CMO and your CEO's office and say, we did 6 million impressions, but not one of them was an underwater welder who we're trying to sell our product to, right? That kind of uniquely has been sort of the marketer's conundrum where, hey, I care more about market saturation than I do about eyeballs and impressions and things like that. Those tend to be vanity metrics at the end of the day. How do you find that balance between, hey, we got to get some of these metrics. We want users, we want people to funnel in, but also staying hyper focused on that niche and saying, look, it's not as flashy, it's not as cool from a number standpoint, but we're reaching market saturation like we've never been. How do you balance that?
Yeah, and that depends. The answer to that question, Ben, it depends on the situation of your organization. If you're a large enterprise with a very mature product and you really know, who this is right for, underwater welders or whoever that is, then you really don't need to focus too much on acquisition. It is the retention. Chances are you already have a high market share, and so your efforts, your limited resources are better spent on retaining those customers with your large market share versus acquiring new customers, because then the lifetime value becomes much longer, the cost to serve them is much lower, and so it's a lot more profitable for you. On the other hand, Ben, if you're a smaller organization, maybe a startup, and you're still figuring this out, right? You haven't figured it out. You don't know. You think you know that this will help your underwater welders in this way, but you may be wrong. You may not be right. In that case, acquisition is far more important because you want to get as many people in as possible. You want to fail fast and learn quickly. You may find that, hey, you know what? The top reason we thought that these underwater welders came because our product was waterproof and it was very like military grade and so on. That's not the reason why they come. They come because our product is like seen as the innovator in the industry, or they come because our product has a really fashionable design. Any number of other reasons. So I would say the answer to your question, how do you balance that? Think about the size of your company, the stage of your product, how mature you are, and if your product is very mature, you know exactly who this is for. Focus more on retention because chances are you'll have a pretty good market share there, and your scarce resources are better used towards retention and improving customer lifetime value. If you're more at the startup end of the spectrum and you're still figuring it out, focus more on acquisition. There'll be plenty of time to focus on retention. So that would be my advice, Ben.
Well, that's a great point. And I'll tell you what, I want to go back to something that you talked about too. You obviously talked about winning those initial conversations, right? And obviously retention on the back end is important. But one thing that the data shows is that a lot of times when you're dealing with public sector organizations and buyers, that sales cycle is pretty extended, right? And that for a lot of marketers is sort of their kryptonite, right? Because you want to be able to prove that things are working. Hey, let's say we've tried all these strategies. We're getting great, eyeballs on our product from our right ICP. But a lot of times those deals take a long time to convert because of things like procurement and obviously winning the deal, making sure the right stakeholders are organized. What are some best practices when you're sort of in limbo there because you've already got the eyeballs and you're not quite to retention? How do you sort of serve in the middle there? I mean, is it more product education? Is it more industry education? What are some of the ways you've seen a lot of value created, especially sort of in that procurement type process?
Yeah, so some of the things that I've learned, and I learned the hard way. I made a lot of mistakes, probably all the mistakes in the book. So, take my advice and maybe don't make as many mistakes as I did. So one is you want to start building your relationships early. you ideally want to find a champion at your target organization who, if you either don't have a personal relationship with, at least there's some reason why they're interested in your product. So find those champions and build those relationships early. And sometimes you may find that the reason why they're slow moving is not necessarily their process. It is because of their mindset. Because guess what? Sometimes customers, they're intimidated by change. Nowadays we're talking all about this AI and all these new technologies. Some people love it. Some people are intimidated by that, right? So what you got to do in that case is you have to pivot your messaging. If you find that your customers are kind of intimidated and trying to slow walk you, then change your messaging to say, hey, it's not about all the technology for technology's sake. Think about the time savings that this will help you with. Think about these other benefits that this will help you with. So talk their language, and you may find that that actually speeds up the process. You may also find that sometimes there are some regulations and some compliance issues that take you all the way to the altar and leave you disappointed, holding the empty bag, right? So look into compliance, look into regulation, make sure that there are no nasty surprises. Otherwise, you don't want to get to the 11th hour and then find that the deal is not going to close. Also, focus on long-term value instead of tit-for-tat features. Oh, that company has this, we've got this. Like, avoid that. Focus on long-term, because when, let's say, a large enterprise or a public sector agency is looking to buy from you, they want to know that you have their back. They want to know that you're a partner for the long term. So yeah, maybe you don't have this one feature or that one feature. That may be okay as long as they're convinced that you are the partner for the long term. So focus long term instead of tit for tat. And the final thing I'll say is understand your customers' budget constraints. And if they do have some of these budget constraints, try to make sure that you can configure your product to fit within their budget. Also look for uh, like grants and other publicly available funding so that it may not have to come from their budget. You may be able to find, especially if you're talking about B2G sales, there may be grants out there. So these are some of the ways I've found to try and accelerate what can be a painfully slow process.
Well, I'll tell you what, the overarching theme, and I love it because you'll have a bunch of marketers fight you tooth and nail about it. Is that marketing? You want it to drive sales, right? If you're on the marketing team, you need to be plugged in with a revenue team. You need to know your numbers. You need to know your average life cycle. You need to know your ICP. A lot of times, I think people get stuck, especially more junior folks. They get stuck in the idea of, oh, I'm just executing a trade show, or I'm just putting together a piece of content, and don't always get to see the larger vision come together. And I think that especially in B2B, if you have that synergy between the revenue team and the marketing team, you're going to see a lot more success because you're working with each other instead of against each other in a lot of ways. I want to as kind of the last question here. I mentioned it earlier a little bit. You've got different decision makers finding their way into the industry, different buyers aging into the industry for the first time, kind of addicted to content, addicted to their cell phones, TikTok, things like that. Obviously, I think the world of B2B has fully kind of embraced at this point the idea that content is important, teaching content, things like that. But what are some of the other macro trends that you anticipate seeing in the next 5 to 10 years, especially as we have a lot of these decision makers aging into the industry for the first time?
Yeah, I think we spend a lot of time talking about sales enablement, which is helping sellers sell better. And we maybe don't spend enough time talking about helping buyers buy easier, right? Like you said, as people are in the buying position, they're going to be overwhelmed. There's going to be an avalanche of information hitting them. And if we think that buyers are confused now, wait 5 years, 10 years, it's going to be mind boggling. And so I think we're going to see technologies that help the buying decision and that journey. And I think that is a very fertile area, which is good news, right? If you're a buyer and you're feeling overwhelmed with all this gobbledygook and jargon and technology, I think technology is going to come to your rescue. You're also going to find that a lot of these technologies are going to serve as a sort of a time machine. Things that took months can now take weeks. Things that took weeks now can take days. Things that took days maybe now can take hours. And so technology is going to serve as a time machine, and it's going to help the buyer as much as it helps sellers.
Well, look, that's golly, I'm gonna start stealing that. Technology is a time machine. Especially you start talking about AI, that's a time saver and a half right there. I'll tell you what, Nitin, it was fantastic to have you on, and this probably won't be the only time that you're on because a lot of the conversations we're having apply to a number of different industries, right? I know today obviously we skewed a little bit more towards public safety, but I think there's a larger need. At a macro scale, for especially folks in B2B, in B2B marketing, particularly, to better understand a lot of the strategies that you talked about, right? Where there's still sort of that old guard at times mindset where everything's got to be, it's a press release and it's a white paper, and PR agencies are blowing it out, which there's obviously still very much room for. But also we continue as B2B to adopt things like influencer content, to adopt things like decentralized content creation, and it's important that we continue having these conversations as strategies change, as they have for the last thousand however years, right? They'll continue to change, and there's no constant. But I'll tell you what, it was incredible to have you on today. Thanks so much for lending your voice to the conversation.
Absolutely. The pleasure was mine, Ben. Really great to be here. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for tuning in to the show. We appreciate you. Be sure to like and subscribe. Check us out next time.